They stuck the notice to my front door at dawn, a white envelope, thick paper, bold type that smelled like someone trying to make a small thing feel final. Remove the structure within 30 days or face enforcement. I stood on the porch with my coffee gone cold in my hand and watched a paper tell me my home was suddenly illegal, and for 3 heartbeats I thought, maybe this is a dream you wake from. Then I remembered my grandfather's handwriting on the back of the old deed and felt the world tilt into something louder. My name is Eli Mercer. This is the story of a cabin that sat on a rise above a thin, stubborn valley for 143 years, a place built with rough hands and stubborn vows. A place where my family tucked every good and bad night between the floorboards and marked the doorway with a carved initial. It's also the story of how a neighborhood meeting, a forged map, and a couple of too many bank transfers turned that cabin into the kind of fight you don't expect until the world makes you have no other choice. I grew up on that ridge, not fancy, not a museum, just a cabin that smelled like pine sap and coffee and my grandmother's apricot jam, the kind of place where you could track 3 generations of life by the nick in the banister. My grandfather left town once to chase a job, came back with a laugh and a pair of muddy boots, and refused to move again. Before he died, he put his papers in a steamer trunk and tacked a scrap of advice on top. Paper says a thing, stone says another, always check both. I never thought I'd have to learn what he meant. The notice said violation, unpermitted structure, and immediate action required. It was signed by the Ridgefield Heights Homeowners Association and stamped with a compliance code that looked surprisingly official. I called the number, of course, because what else do you do, and got a polite voice that thanked me for my attention and promised an inspector the following week. I laughed then, a small, nervous sound, and hung up. That laugh turned into a pit in my stomach when the next thing arrived. A photograph of the cabin taken from the street, time-stamped, with a red circle somebody had drawn around the porch like it was evidence in a trial. You learn a lot about what matters when what you have is threatened. It isn't just the beams and nails, it's my grandmother's laughter carved in the kitchen door, the faded postcard pinned by the mantel, the last letter my father wrote and tucked under the floorboard. It's 100 tiny reckonings that don't add up on a tax form. So I did the sensible thing. I opened the steamer trunk. I pulled out a brittle packet wrapped in oilcloth, and there it was, a land patent dated 1879, a survey with hand-sketched lines and ink that had bled into the paper like memory bleeding into time. The surveyor's marks were simple: a cedar, a stone marked M, and a creek that ran when the snow melted. The map in my hand matched the stones in my yard. That should have been enough, but paper, it turns out, makes an excellent target. I hired June Alvarez, a property attorney who looks like she drinks black coffee for breakfast and burns injustice for lunch. We'll stare at the maps until they blink, she said, and I like that. We started with the county clerk's office, polite people, dusty files, a cartload of blueprints, and that's where the first real smell of trouble came in. A newer map, dated 3 years earlier, showed the HOA boundary shifted 3 lots east, an adjustment that conveniently put my cabin inside their common area. The signature looked machine-printed, the seal a little off-center. The county clerk's stamp didn't match the rest. This is odd, he said, and wrote the word like an incantation. It's amazing how quickly neighbors show their colors. The next HOA meeting was the sort of scene you'd see in any suburban bad dream. Folding chairs in a community room, coffee urns, a woman at the head of the table who smiled like she'd practiced winning. Her name was Marjorie Lane, president of the Ridgefield Heights HOA. Sharp suits, sharper eyes, a necklace that matched the glare in her voice. She had diagrams on the easel and a crowd of folks who nodded, some uncertain, some hungry for authority. She called my cabin an encroachment, she called it non-compliant, she called it a liability. She sounded like someone reading from a script that had been written in advance. What gives you the right? I asked her at the meeting, though I already had the smell of the trunk in my jacket and the patent folded like an answer in my pocket. Marjorie looked at me like I'd interrupted something delicate. The association acts in the interest of common safety and property values, she said, which is HOA speak for. Do things that make us look good and make other people bend. When I mentioned the 1879 patent, she smiled in a way that didn't touch her eyes. We have updated records, she said. We are following process. Process, it turned out, is a tool plenty of people use to tidy up inconvenient facts. I hired a surveyor, a man named Paul Dobson, who had the patience of a man who reads maps for breakfast. He walked the property in boots scuffed with mud and looked for those evidence stones my grandfather used to say wouldn't lie. They were there, carved EM 1879, on one, set deep in the ground like punctuation. Paul looked back at the paper I'd brought, then at the stones, and his jaw did a small work of surprise. Someone tried to redraw the edges, he said. On paper it's neat. On the ground, it's a lie. You'd hope that's where the story gets simple. Official documents, match stones, the right thing recognized. But if life were a fair fight, we'd have a lot fewer stories worth telling. The whistleblower came in the person of Tommy Reed, a guy who used to run the HOA books and had the nervous, guilty laugh of somebody who'd misread his life choices. He pulled me aside at a church rummage sale and slid me a manila envelope as if passing contraband. Inside were emails, dry strings of text and spreadsheets that, when you lined them up, looked like a pipeline. Payments routed to a shell company. An email thread where Marjorie and a developer named Ross Harlan discussed expediting lot consolidation, notes about removing problem parcels, and a copy of that suspicious map with margins and notes in hand. Tommy's hands shook when he said, I didn't know where else to put it. He'd lost sleep over it, he said, and now he decided he couldn't sleep some other way. Whatever guilt he carried had teeth. We needed them. When you're up against the system, you find unexpected allies. The DA's office had someone who listened to a woman named Ava Klein, who'd made a practice of prosecuting small-time corruption that smelled like neighborhood-level greed. She read the emails, handed them back, and said, "There's a pattern." The pattern was finance and influence braided together. Donations to committees, consulting fees paid to a company Ross controlled, board votes taken in backrooms. The plot wasn't an explosive Hollywood conspiracy. It was a slow, methodical squeeze, and method is easier to prove if you collect the receipts. Things escalated quickly. The HOA upped the fines. Someone slashed the tires of a truck that had a Save the Cabin bumper sticker. There were anonymous, venomous posts on the local neighborhood app. Neighbors I'd known for years stopped answering my waves at the mailbox. We filed motions. We sent certified letters. We got nasty grams that said we were exercising poor judgment. One of Marjorie's board members called my landlord to suggest I was a liability. That's the ugly part when escalation stops being administrative and becomes personal. You suddenly find yourself explaining to the mail carrier why you left your porch light on, why you look a certain way, why you keep the curtains drawn. I'll admit, I had nights where fear ate the edges of me. I'd sit by the wood stove and trace the ink on the old map, and think about giving up, about selling the cabin to someone who liked things tidy. There's a cheap comfort in surrender fewer phone calls, a mailbox that stops threatening you with removal. June would look at me and say, gently, "This is the hill you're on, Eli." And by then, it had become more than a hill. It was a hill with the shape of my life on it. The midpoint of the fight, the moment it stopped being a small person's battle and turned into a public thing, came when the county issued a preliminary hold on enforcement pending investigation. The judge, in a motion hearing packed with neighbors and cameras, looked at the patent and the old survey and said, "There's enough here to pause." It felt like a breath we'd been holding was released, and for a short, dizzy hour, I felt relief so sharp I almost laughed. But relief, in fights like this, is not a destination. It's a pause between breaths. The DA convened a grand jury. Ross Harlan started returning calls. Lawyers started wearing nicer ties. There was theater to the legal parts, the subpoenas and document dumps and depositions, but the human scenes were what kept me awake. I remember the night Marjorie came to my porch during a thunderstorm, hair plastered, rain making her suit cling like guilt. She stood on the path and said, "Eli, we can work this out." There was no apology in her voice. There was a bargaining chip. "Your cabin sits where it does. It's not ideal for the association." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the world had grown corkscrew absurd and I wanted to know what she would ask next. "What do you want?" I asked. She smiled that tight smile. "We want your cooperation on certain easement issues." Translation: the association wanted control over access that would make my lot useful to developers. I wanted to tell her that cooperation wasn't the same as consent, that somebody doesn't get to erase a family history because it fits better for a project. Instead I said, "No." She shrugged like she expected I would, as if no was a minor inconvenience. She turned and walked away, which was when I noticed in the puddle of the porch light the flash of a small camera, someone shadowed in the hedge with a device. We started sleeping with the back door locked after that. The trial, when it finally came, was a slow machine that revealed the small, human things that led to larger crimes. Ross Harlan's angle was plausible sounding. He liked to call himself a revitalizer, a man who moved investments into blighted areas to bring value. On paper it sounded like civic virtue. In practice it smelled like profit. The emails lined up like a breadcrumb path. A consult fee here, a friendly donation there, a not-so-friendly push to resolve problem parcels. The grand jury found probable cause, and suddenly we weren't just answering an HOA complaint. We were part of a public corruption case. Courtrooms are strange theaters, the shuffle of papers, the whisper of shoes, the way a pause can sound like a verdict already. The prosecutor, Ava, did a thing of careful cruelty. She read a line of emails aloud, then let silence fall. "We will show this jury how the association documents were altered, how the map was reproduced with different margins, how payments were routed," she said. The defense tried to call it misunderstanding, clerical errors, normal adjustments in civic life. When they played a recording of a meeting where Marjorie laughed and said, "We'll just relocate the cabin on paper," a hush ran through the audience like a wind. Marjorie took the stand. There's a strange courage in watching someone you once thought you could reason with hurt themselves on their own words. She had rehearsed lines that sounded like proper governance, but the emails were little daggers that made holes in her story. At one point she said, "We acted in the interest of our homeowners," and someone in the back, a woman who'd come to support me and whose pool was supposedly at risk because of my property, shouted, "At whose interest?" It was the first time someone called out the shift in the room, and it landed like a splash. There were ugly moments, private ones, that the trial didn't need to show, but that taught me more than any document. My neighbor, Mrs. Halloway, used to bring over pies and the sort of gossip that made a row of houses feel like a family. During the trial, she came to the steps and wept in a way that made me catch my breath. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought we were doing what was best." The line between ignorance and complicity is thin, and in communities built on trust, the truth sometimes needs a sledgehammer. The verdict felt like a small miracle and a rebuke wrapped together. Guilty on several counts: fraud, conspiracy to alter public records, influence peddling. Ross Harlan got a sentence that left his suits at home for a while. Marjorie, the woman who'd convocated rules like scripture, got to look at the consequences of decisions that had been words on a page until we made them matter. The board resigned en masse, and the HOA installed an interim committee that admitted, in a press release, that they had mishandled things. They used the word mistake, which is the safe word of people who knew it was more than that. They promised reform. People clapped because there are rituals that follow accountability, and applause is one of them. You think that after the climax there's an easy denouement where the house stands and the world is restored. We got a kind of restoration. The county recorded the old survey as the primary document for the lot. The stones in my yard were re-inspected and their markings certified, and the cabin got a modest plaque from the local historical society that reads like small justice. I opened the cabin one Sunday to neighbors who wanted to see what we'd been defending. Some came with apologies, some with questions, some simply to touch the wood and confirm that it was real. The plaque says, Mercer Cabin established 1879. It looks good next to the charring on the hearth that tells a longer story. And yet there's always the aftertaste. Not everyone forgives. The divisions we'd poked at didn't knit themselves back overnight. Some neighbors refused to look at me. Others sided with me until the next fancy development promised a better sidewalk and forgot their earlier outrage. The DA's office recovered funds to compensate a handful of households who'd been maneuvered, but money doesn't always equal repair. You can't put hours back into the years you lost watching friends become strangers. Most nights I sit on that porch as the light goes soft and think about what changed. The cabin didn't just survive because of legal papers and stones. It survived because a handful of people were willing to make themselves inconvenient. People like Tommy, who risked more than his job to tell the truth. Like June, who read dusty laws for the poetry they could be. Like Ava, who looked at neighborhood bureaucracy and saw the shape of crime. And like my grandfather, who tucked his life into a trunk and told me, in the way old men do, to look for the stones. There are ugly lessons, too. Power is patient and it likes paperwork. It will use the same polite procedures you trust to make a bad thing look tidy. It takes time and presence to spot at the same time and presence that a lot of people don't have. The smell of progress is often sweet enough to make folks forget how it was made. Our community now talks about reform a lot. Transparent voting, independent audits, clear maps recorded at the county level. Across meetings and forums and late-night emails, people are insisting on openness, and that is a victory in itself. But the victory is also fragile, the kind you have to set a place for at the table every day. If there is a scene that haunts me, it's not the courtroom or the press conference. It's a quiet morning a year after the verdict when I walked the property line with my nephew, Jonah, who was 8 then and obsessed with how trees make shadows. He plucked at the grass and asked, seriously, is this your land? I crouched and pointed to the carved stone and said, yes. He frowned like someone grading an answer and asked, did the people who tried to take it know what was here? I told him, honestly, maybe they didn't care. He thought a moment and then said, well, then they were wrong. That's the kind of clarity kids have, a small, uncompromising sense of rightness that complicates grown-up excuses. So where does this leave us? I don't have tidy moral bows to tie up every loose end. The board was replaced, the developer's company restructured under oversight, and a few people left town quietly. But the most important thing we gained, and the thing that made this worth the nights I woke up counting the cost, was the knowledge that a community can notice when governance goes off course, and that people will, sometimes, choose to act. We learned about how easy it is for authority to find a way to paper over what matters, and we learned how stubbornness, the kind that puts stones and signatures against the tide, can matter more than you think. I want you, listening, to imagine a place that matters to you. It might be a house, a tree, a small business, a memory in an attic. Ask yourself what you would do if someone put a typed notice on its door. Would you open the trunk? Would you look for the mark on the stone? Would you risk the awkwardness of being inconvenient? You don't have to answer now, but I'd like to hear what you think. Tell me if you'd stand, or walk away, or find some other path. Was justice served here, or was it just a stopgap until the next clever map appears? Who do you trust to watch over the things that matter? If you've got a story like this, or if you've watched an HOA or a committee or a developer take something you loved, write it in the comments. Tell me what you did. Tell me what you wish you'd done. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that paper can be altered, but stone remembers. If you believe in community oversight, press that like button and consider sharing this video so others will sit up and check their own porches. And if you want more deep dive stories about small fights that turned into big changes, subscribe, because I'll keep telling them, and you'll keep telling me yours. In the end, the cabin stands. The porch creaks in a way that sounds like someone telling a joke they've told 100 times, and the neighbor's dog still chases the same squirrels. People still drive by, and not all of them know what happened here. That's the quiet part of justice. It doesn't always come with a parade. Sometimes it's a plaque, a restored survey, and the soft, stubborn habit of coming home.